Hello. As we have seen in the last two lectures, which focused on West Africa and East Africa, the spread of Iron Age agriculture and pastoralism and the development of long-distance trade set the stage for the emergence of towns and states. Southern Africa is no exception to that pattern. However, since farming and ironworking generally moved southward across the continent, the southern African subcontinent was the last major region to be transformed. Nonetheless, radiocarbon dates for archaeological research show evidence for the whole so-called Iron Age package, that is, crops, cattle, and iron, south of the Limpopo River in modern-day South Africa by the 3rd century AD, and has spread through the whole eastern half of that country by around 1000 AD. I should add that this also was part of the arrival of Bantu peoples and languages which came to dominate in the eastern half of South Africa. Now, these radiocarbon dates represented the sort of death knell. They were the most decisive refutation of an apartheid-era notion of the so-called empty land. You'll often see references to this as the so-called empty land, or excuse me, the myth of the empty land. Now, the myth of the empty land has had a long staying power in South Africa, and it shows up in curious places. I actually have encountered it, not so much recently, but 20 years or so ago, I would encounter it more than once among ordinary Americans who, thank God, were curious enough to delve into South African history, for instance, a bit. Now, the myth of the empty land took a number of forms. I think probably one of the more extreme forms I ever heard was from the real estate guy who was trying to sell me my first home. And when he learned what I did for a living, he obviously had done some delving into Southern African history, which I'm always happy to see. And anyway, he pronounced that most people are unaware that in fact South Africa was empty, and that I believe his actual words were, "The blacks came down to get the jobs." Now, I would say again that's a rather an extreme elaboration of the myth of the empty land. More commonly, it was simply held that Bantu peoples and Iron Age cultures were moving into South Africa at about the same time that Europeans were moving in their frontier expansion to the country as well. Now, clearly, this myth had political, you might say moral political utility, as people like my old mentor, Leonard Thompson, of Yale showed in his rather brilliant book, The Political Mythology of Apartheid. What I mean is, by moral political, if it is true that the bulk of South African land was not occupied or not held by the ancestors of the indigenous majority, then it certainly puts a different light. It means that it was not necessarily expropriated or taken away from that population by the immigrant Europeans. Now, as I say, this is fallen rather hard under the impact of radiocarbon dating in particular. But myths, including historical myths, however misleading they may be, often, contain a kernel somewhere in there, a grain of truth. I mean, even my real estate man, the blacks came down to get the jobs. Well, the kernel of truth is, of course, that in the 19th and 20th century, he's right. Millions of blacks did come down from areas further north and engage in the migrant labor pattern, which is going to be so important to our discussion of South African history later in the course. And in this case, again, the kernel of truth here. It is true that Bantu expansion, Iron Age culture expansion, apparently halted at the point, the so-called 20-inch rainfall line, where there was insufficient moisture for their crops. Now, this 20-inch rainfall line that I referred to is a line, it may be a bit of an exaggeration to consider it a single line, but a zone, let us say, which runs north to south and essentially bisects modern-day Republic of South Africa. To the east of that line, to the right side of that line on the map, there was an excess of 20 inches on average of rainfall a year, which is about the minimum for the cultivation of crops. To the west of that line, to the left side of the map, there generally was not, with the exception, however, of course, of that Mediterranean basin in and around Cape Town. But remember that from where the 20-inch rainfall line falls to Cape Town is a space of several hundred miles, so there's a considerable gap in there. One can always ask the question, would it have been possible for Mandela's ancestors, the Xhosa peoples of South Africa, who are the southernmost Bantu people, to have, I'm going to use this term, to have colonized that Mediterranean basin? Well, yes and no. Again, our adaptation of crops to environment. The crops that they were used to cultivating, like millet and so forth, in fact, don't do well like a grain like wheat does in that Mediterranean climate. Nonetheless, it's always useful to ask what might have happened. It's conceivable, but as we'll see, something else happened instead. So, these cultures then were of the late Bantu Iron Age are concentrated on the right side inside the modern Republic of South Africa. To the west of that line, there was no extension of cultivation, although there was an adoption by considerable numbers of people of half of the agricultural revolution, and they became pastoralists. We'll meet them again when we look at the formation of the Cape Colony. Now, in the later Iron Age, let us say the late first millennium AD, especially in the savanna grasslands of what is now western Zambia, Zimbabwe, eastern Botswana, and eastern South Africa, we see increasing wealth, complexity, stratification, and commerce. We've seen it before in other parts of Africa, and we're seeing it again. The hilltop settlements known as the Tautswe tradition, where the name comes from the largest excavated site in eastern Botswana, seem to illustrate the importance, above all, of one of our old friends, increasing numbers of cattle. Again, the measure, the store of wealth, perhaps supreme in this part of the world. Control of cattle was the key to power and wealth, and because cattle were held by males in general, this may also have sharpened the gender divide, if you will. Emerging slightly later was the cultural complex called Leopard's Kopje, after a site in southwestern Zimbabwe. The word Kopje, K-O-P-J-E, is actually Afrikaans, the Dutch-based language for hill. Certainly cattle in this successor cultural complex remained central. Peoples here in this rather dry part, especially dry part of, we could say, the southern savanna, maximize the efficiency of cultivation by the use of stone terracing on hillsides. They also use stone to construct residences and cattle enclosures. And the peoples of the Leopard's Kopje culture mined not only iron, but large quantities of copper, and then probably beginning in the 10th century, again, very late in the first millennium, gold. The culmination of the Leopard's Kopje culture early in the second millennium AD was what we could perhaps style as the first urban center in southern Africa. And that was the town of Mapungubwe, located around a hill site just south of the Limpopo River in modern-day South Africa. The physical evidence here, which has been extracted for decades by particularly archaeologists from the University of Pretoria, but is only now showing up in places like museums in South Africa and so forth, suggests a sharply defined hierarchy. Rulers at literally the top of the hill, living indeed like royalty, living in structures made of stone, and the flatter country, or the bottom portions of the hill, were the poorer commoners. Mapungubwe was clearly connected with the Swahili-dominated East Coast that we surveyed in the last lecture. Ivory and gold were traded eastward, and excavations have uncovered many glass beads from India in particular, and fine Chinese porcelain bowls at Mapungubwe. Now, the full flower, in a sense, of these southern developments is seen at Great Zimbabwe, located in the central portions of the modern country, of course, which took the name of Zimbabwe at its independence in 1980. This was the capital of a major late Iron Age state, generally given the same name, a bit like Mexico City being the capital of Mexico, if you like. The city of Great Zimbabwe represented the largest stone ruins, represents today the largest stone ruins in Africa south of the Nile River. Great Zimbabwe comprises essentially two focal points. There is the so-called hill complex, which, as you'd expect, is located on the hill where the kings and the royals resided for most of the time, and the valley complex, which housed the ordinary citizens of this town of perhaps 20,000 people. But the valley complex also included the most impressive single ruin, the high-walled Great Enclosure. The Great Enclosure has an outer wall which runs in an elliptical shape for approximately 700 feet. Its greatest diameter is the greatest space between the edges of the walls is approximately 300 feet across. The walls themselves are 30 to 35 feet high, sometimes decorated at the top, or in other cases even midway by coursing. Coursing is the word for a layering of stone, by decorative patterns. The largest walls at the base are some 15 feet thick, and they are solid throughout. There's no cavity in them, although they taper upwards and therefore narrow as they reach the top. This is the largest single structure by a considerable margin in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the Great Enclosure, with its passageways, its stairs, its inner chambers surrounding the so-called conical tower, which again is about 30 feet high and about 20 feet at its base, was likely the political and indeed the religious focal point of the nation. In other words, the speculation by archaeologists is that at certain moments, obviously harvest festivals, religious rites, etc., that the kings probably descended from the hill complex and carried out these practices inside the Great Enclosure, and most likely around this so-called conical tower. Millions of blocks of stone went into the walls of Great Zimbabwe. It must have taken many years, probably, certainly we can talk about decades to complete, which was accomplished by about the year 1300 or so. The granite outcrops in this part of southern Africa have fissure lines, so-called fracture planes, created in over eons by a constant alternation of exposure to a very bright and warm sun, but very cold nights, because this is situated on a plateau at about 4,000 feet elevation or so. By addition, on the part of the builders, of additional heat to these granite outcrops, in a sense, it's possible to sort of peel off the granite in more or less flattish layers. At that point, the builders are able to cut and finally shape the individual granite blocks with what else? Iron tools. We encounter again an example of how none of this is on the cards until this gift of iron becomes part of African life. Now, the walls are dry stacked. That is, there is no mortar used in the construction of Great Zimbabwe in these millions of blocks. And again, the fact that they are still standing predominantly 700 years or so later suggests that there was certainly considerable skill on the part of the dry stack masons. Archaeologists believe that the largest buildings here are designed primarily to convey the power and the prestige of the rulers, almost by cloaking them behind these walls and imposing or imparting an air of secrecy and mystery. And, you know, to visit this place, it certainly does emit this aura of mystery. European architecture, of course, long ago became quite concerned with the straight line, the sharp corner, often the right angle corner, et cetera, and obviously this created some masterpieces. This is very different. There are no corners at Great Zimbabwe. It's constant gentle curves and ellipses. Often, particularly in the hill complex, the constructions of the humans are, in essence, blended into and make use of the actual granite outcrops themselves. So you have this combination of sort of the human injection of construction with what was put there by nature. When I say mysterious, you know, if you go from go inside the great enclosure and down a passageway which lies between the outer wall and an immediately parallel inner one, and leads over a course of 200 or 300 feet into this kind of inner sanctum of the conical tower, that's quite an experience. First of all, the sun, you know, because it's such a narrow passage, very rarely hits it. And you walk in there and suddenly, you know, the temperature is about 10 degrees cooler. It starts out at probably about 8 feet wide, but it continually shrinks and narrows so that by the time you finally see the tower in front of you, and the speculation again is this would have been sort of the center of the religious political life of the nation, it's barely as wide as your shoulders. Now, as I said, this is perched on the edge, as it were, of the quite high-lying Zimbabwe plateau, a classic example of one of those overturned bowl images that I used earlier. Great Zimbabwe was well situated to take advantage of both the high country pasturage and low country pasturage, or in Southern African terminology, high veld and low veld pasturage. In other words, in the much drier winter months, you could move cattle down into the lower country and take advantage of still flowing rivers and pasturage there. There's no question that we see an enormous multiplication then in wealth as measured by the presence and the possession of cattle. And there's some interesting evidence that comes from this of what we might call the royal, or at least the elite lifestyle. In the 1960s and 70s, some excavators intentionally began to collect fragments of animal bones to try to get at some clues about Great Zimbabwe. They collected something like 140,000 pieces of this. And they did a fairly detailed examination of no less than 20,000 or so of them. Of the 20,000, all but 263 of them, in other words, well over 99% or so, were in fact cattle bones, but something more interesting occurred here. 80% or so of these cattle had apparently died, had apparently been slaughtered at the ages of approximately 24 to 30 months. That is the prime time for beef. And it certainly suggests that there was a very regular slaughter of cattle to provide beef for the consumption of an elite. Because you may recall in lecture number 6, I was quite emphatic in saying that cattle alive to an ordinary African cultivator long ago or today are too valuable living to embark on regular slaughter. In the case of the capital of a major state and its elite, that's not necessarily the case. Now, Great Zimbabwe is even better placed than Mapungubwe to export gold and ivory to the east coast. And the ruins have yielded many samples, far more than Mapungubwe, by far the most of any single site, of prestige goods brought in from India, Persia, China, the usual suspects at this point. Glazed Persian bowls with inscriptions on them from the 13th and 14th century. Again, the Chinese porcelain and Caledon ware, glass beads from India and the Near East. There, of course, was homegrown treasure as well, perhaps above all the carved stone birds, which represented the oracle of the king, you might say. Again, there's some evidence of divine kingship of a sort, or semi-divine kingship. Unfortunately, most of these birds, there were probably 8 or 10 of them, and we're talking about sculptures that are probably 6 feet high or so. Most of them were actually looted when outsiders first reached this city about a century ago. After independence in 1980, quite a number of them were actually recovered and brought back to the museum there by the ruins. Now, for reasons that are not entirely clear, by the way, just one more thing on those stone carved birds, the so-called Shiri Yamwari, or bird of God, has become the modern symbol of the nation of Zimbabwe. It appears, for instance, on their flag. For reasons that are not entirely clear, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned rather suddenly, sometime around 1500 or so. The experts have ruled out evidence of invasion here and have generally turned to ecological explanations. Again, we've seen exhaustion of local resources, particularly timber, in the case of Merowe, for instance. Some speculation that perhaps a human disease epidemic or a cattle epizootic may have led to the abandonment of it. However, the kingdom which Great Zimbabwe anchored was clearly the prototype for a series of successor states built by Zimbabwe's Shona peoples, the largest single ethnic group in Zimbabwe, past and present. And these successor states like Torwa or Matapa, the last of these, survived to the 19th century. And the capitals of these later states, although not as large, were constructed of stone in a similar style, in some cases even more intricate. My personal favorite is a Zimbabwe, a small z there, representing the sort of generic term, translated usually as, literal meaning is house of stone, but it generally carries the connotation of royal court. Sometimes it's simply translated as capital. At Nalatali, there is a Zimbabwe with a small z, and this is on top of a really high hill. It's beautifully decorated with several examples of the chevron styles and alternating coloration of stone and so forth at various stages in the coursing. There's some speculation it may have been a sort of summer getaway because of the coolness of the very high hill for the old royalty. Now, let us flash forward a bit. After the British, led by Cecil Rhodes, colonized southern Rhodesia, which of course is the same which became modern Zimbabwe, many white settlers who came to the country refused to believe that Africans were capable of such a creation as Great Zimbabwe. The civilizing mission, so-called, of colonial rule, it seemed, required the absence of anything resembling civilization prior to its arrival. Instead, the official line was that Great Zimbabwe was a mystery. Now, it is mysterious, as I just tried to convey, but not exactly in the context that it was intended here. That it was, the origins of it were a mystery, that perhaps it was the doing of the lost tribe of Israel, or indeed the Queen of Sheba, whom we encountered in the lecture on Ethiopia, or maybe the Phoenicians had a colony here long, long ago that was lost, King Solomon's mines, and so on. In other words, anybody but the local Africans. Just to give some of the flavor of this, a book published in the 1960s concluded, quote, that Great Zimbabwe is completely out of character of the Bantu and has no justification from other Negroid parts of Africa, past or present. As late as 1974, the old Rhodesian regime sent instructions to essentially the Parks Department that any brochure on Great Zimbabwe, quote, should indicate quite clearly that as yet no irrefutable evidence is available on the origin of the ruins, unquote. Now, this contradicted the quite clear conclusions of every professional archaeologist for almost 100 years who had examined these ruins, starting with Randall McIver in 1905, Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1931, and followed by people like Peter Garlake and Roger Summers later. They all concluded that it was of local origin, built by ancestors of the Shona and of medieval vintage. For one, part of the evidence for that is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, Great Zimbabwe is not unique. It's simply the largest of some 200 of these Zimbabwe, small z, that are found all through Zimbabwe today, in the western parts of Mozambique, in the eastern parts of Botswana, and the northern parts of South Africa. In this part of the world, people built in stone whenever it was available. The pottery, and there's an enormously greater amount of pottery scattered over the entire town site than anything else, including the more exotic importations and so forth, bear all the hallmarks of the period of pottery style and design that was typical of the Shona ancestors in that period. Roger Summers, who was a fine archaeologist and eventually had a sort of precarious position because his salary was paid by the Rhodesian government in the 1970s, and he commented at one point that anybody who questioned the notion of external construction of this, that this had been done by outsiders, in Summers' words, quote, was met by anything from polite incredulity to downright abuse. And Summers found out the hard way that that was true. I remember clearly a moment from graduate school in the 1970s. We had just read a book by Summers called Ancient Gold Mining in Rhodesia, and walked into the seminar, and Leonard Thompson, the teacher, mentioned that he had just heard that Roger Summers had been sacked for, in essence, following his professional conscience, if you like, and asserting the local origin of Great Zimbabwe. Now, a couple of lectures ago, when we were looking at the history of ancient Egypt, its relation to the history of ancient Greece, it took up these questions like who were the ancient Egyptians, what color were they, and so forth. It simply underscores that as human beings, we cannot help, any of us cannot help, viewing the past repeatedly from our own perspective. All we can do, and I'm not saying that we should avoid that, all we can do is be aware, in a sense, of how the contemporary concerns we have, how these contemporary lenses are affecting perhaps our view of the past. I would suggest again, perhaps in an echo of how I ended the lecture on Egypt, that the colonial Rhodesian mythology about Great Zimbabwe is most revealing about the colonizers themselves. We foreshadowed here some lectures which will concentrate, in fact, in our penultimate 35th lecture on the origins of the contemporary crisis in Zimbabwe. Thank you.